Yeah, it's a vibe. It's a vibe. Okay. Okay. Yo, what's up? And welcome to the Roots and Branches podcast, the first episode of season 2. Yes, we are back. Yes, we are back. Hey, thanks again for coming to join me. I am your host, Dr. Daryl Powell. To some, but for most of y'all, Daryl. Some people call me by my childhood nickname, Duke. For those who know, you know. What's up, y'all? And again, welcome back. Hey, again, this is the only podcast that I can talk about your uncle. And you may get nervous about it, or you may learn something. Again, welcome to season 2 of Roots and Branches podcast. So yeah, man, we're going to pick right back up where we left off. Just to give a quick recap for you guys, we left off in season 1, really describing and talking about my grandmother's family on the Hinton side. And if you remember, only if you remember, and if you haven't, go back and check it out. But if you remember the last episode, you might have been surprised to learn about my grandmother's father, Gary Kears, and how his life subsequently came to an end. He was murdered by a young man who, pretty much accused him of beating up his mother, whom in this case would have been his mistress. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive deeper. So I was thinking about, hey, what can I do with season 2? And I just, basically said, hey, season 2 has to be a continuation of season 1 because I really want to talk about where my grandmother's family originated on both sides. And so for a lot of people that don't know, just a quick reminder, my grandmother, his name is Nellie Wilson. Her maiden name is Kears, and the Kears name derives from her father's side, Gary Kears. And we're going to highlight Gary as kind of the focal point of this season, similar to how we centered Inez Hinton around season 1 on my mother's side. But before we get to, I would say, the real meat and potatoes of the people, I always like to set the tone of the environment, right? So in season 1, remember, we spent a lot of time in Johnston County, North Carolina, And what I pointed out is that a lot of people thought, including myself growing up, that my grandmother she really grew up in South Carolina. And while that is true, to an extent, a lot of her formidable years was in North Carolina and Johnston County. However, South Carolina does have roots in my grandmother's story. And more notably, those roots follow the Kearses and more notably Gary Kears, who were natives of South Carolina, specifically Orangeburg. So yeah, we'll jump right into that. Just to give you some context. We're going to be talking a lot about Bamberg County. Shout out to Bamberg County. I see y'all. Again, I got to get back down there soon. Bamberg County and the surrounding areas of Orangeburg, Denmark, Olar. And these regions help kind of shape the story here. Just want to give you just a little brief history. Before European settlers came to South Carolina, this was home to a very large Indian population called the Edisto, Edisto. So we're talking about years before 1619 years, subsequent before slavery. There were a larger clan of the Cusbano Nation of Native Americans, known for being absolute great fishermen and women. They hunted the deep forests of South Carolina and they cultivated a lot of crops, right? So, by the mid 1600s, though, you have more European settlers and explorers come into the colonies, and most notably South Carolina in this regard. And you start to see Spanish settlers like Hernando de Soto, who, came the 1670s and really started to erase these Native Americans off of their land, with forcing them to leave their land. And in a lot of cases, also subsequently spreading diseases that come from Europe. So, that's kind of how the colonial era begins. It's very similar to what I was telling you guys about the formation of Johnson County. So I think it's important to note that even before we go into, the slavery stuff, the Jim Crow stuff, remember that these lands were inhabited by indigenous people who had this land way before we even thought about it. Needless to say, between the 16th and 18th century, as the English started to settle the Carolinas, the region that we are going to talk about the most in reference to Bamberg fell under the district of Orangeburg. And this was a vast stretch of land where a lot of enslavement happened. And this is just due to the booming fields. Anybody that knows South Carolina, you are familiar with, that Carolina rice, very famous rice from that region of North Carolina. And so, the transatlantic slave trade, which we don't have to go into details about, everybody knows the horror of slavery, but bringing those thousands and thousands and thousands of West Africans to this region to cultivate cotton and more subsequently rice. This labor really fueled the upper country of South Carolina and the low country of South Carolina. But we're going to focus on that northern part of South Carolina, like I said. And, you also have a subsequent group. Keep saying the word subsequent. You have the group of people also known as the Gullah or Geechee people, who are very native to these regions as well. And we'll talk more about that cultural insight. It's also important to note that in this time frame, you have the real rise of King Cotton, right? So just to take a quick little historical detour, when settlers in America came, the cotton industry for slavery was not completely built out, right? And so you have about 100-year to 200-year period between the early 1600s to about the mid to late 1700s, where there is a carving out of sort of a economy around cotton. By the time you get to the late 1700s, America is, booming when it comes to the moving of Black people and using them as slaves, and the economy specifically around cotton, right? And this was really fast forwarded by the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney, I believe. So yes, as ugly as it is, the economy of slavery was big, and no region in the world or in America benefited from this more than areas like South Carolina, right? And so we'll dig a little bit deeper into that, but I just think that it's important to note that this is a huge part of our story here. We have some genealogy documentation about the possible origins of the Kearse name and the plantation where we possibly came from. There's a lot there. So buckle up on just the talk of slavery. I just want to give you a precursor. If you are a person who is offended by Black people talking about slavery, this probably ain't going to be the episodes for you subsequently. Again, word subsequently. But anyway, okay. So shortly after the boom of cotton, we see something that happens, and that is the industrialization of South Carolina with things like railroads and other businesses, as the economy of America is really trying to expand outside of using Black people to do stuff. But you do see the railroad industry come to places like Bamberg. And there is a interesting connection between the railroads and Inez and Gary, my great-great-grandfather, and my grandmother. So we will talk about a little bit about that. And then, you see things like the Freedmen's Bureau that pops up in the late 80s that really help shape some of the industry and the region of Bamberg with the help or not help of the Freedmen's Bureau and the U.S. Army. What's most important to note here is that the formation of Bamberg County, I believe, was about 1897 and it split from Barnwell County. Bamberg is named after a local politician named Francis Marion Bamberg. We will talk about him. And the town of Denmark, that is a town in Bamberg County, was incorporated around 1891. So we'll talk about the railroad hub in that region and what made this area so attractive to so many Black folks. Time out for a second. I have this real interesting joke that's not really a joke, but it really describes that all Black people in America come from South Carolina. And there's some truth to that in some ways. But what I'm really saying is that most Black people come from the legacy of cattle slavery in regions like South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. But needless to say that we will talk about what made this region so popular for a lot of African American. And, we'll talk about why it wasn't that great. But we'll also talk about that in mid-segregation, we really have some things that pop up in this area, like the formation of Voorhees College in Denmark that became a beacon of African-American education for Black men and women of Bamberg to secure education, land, and economic opportunities. We'll also talk about what happened in the 1920s and the 1930s as we start to see the devastation of crops in Bamberg and how it affected the Black economic industry. And then on a more somber note, we'll talk about the lynchings in South Carolina between 1877 and 1950 and the 4 lynchings that historically occurred in Bamberg, although we think there's a lot more. And then we'll kind of come through the civil rights era and then also talk about the modern challenges and cultural legacy. With that frame, we're going to start with a man named Parrish Draper, and Draper being a name that is not Kearse, but you'll see that Parrish Draper's name in this podcast is a real good starting point. The one thing that I have to mention is that talking to my mom, Daphne Powell, aka Big Dat, one of the things that me and Mom talked about is the long list of names and knowledge that we get from, let's say, the information from season 1 in Inez. We don't have that same privilege here in season 2 with the Kearse name. One of the things that I think is fascinating about the Kearse name is the Kearse name is a name in our family that is widespread throughout the United States. However, because the Kearse name may be originated on the planet with so many slaves, there's a huge chance that majority of the Kearses that are widespread outside of areas like South Carolina, going into areas like New York, Florida, Texas, whatever the case is, we're not all related. We have common ancestry in our name, but not through blood. So we'll talk a little bit about what that means and what that looks like. But I think going into next episode, we're going to talk more about Parrish Draper, who is probably the first documented person that we can go the furthest back on and how it connects to the Kearse name. I think you're going to be very surprised about who Parrish Draper was and what he meant to South Carolina and specifically that area. And then we'll kind of go through the history of who Parrish Draper married, who's his wife, and then that will kind of culminate when that Draper name turns to Kearse at some point in time in the timeline. Cool? So, yeah. I knew that was a lot. I know that was a fast crash course into the region that we are talking about specifically today. But remember, we're going to start in South Carolina, specifically in Bamberg. Hey, family and friends in Bamberg, hit me up if you got things that you would like to tell me. I think I may reach out to 1 or 2 people to maybe interview them about their lives in this region during, post-civil rights, era. There's still a lot of family that we have in that region, specifically a lot of my grandmother's first cousins. And so a lot of their children can bring a lot of context to just, what this area means to us and kind of what it looks like today and how that family legacy still carries on. So again, thank you for joining today's episode of the Roots and Branches podcast. We will broadcast this every Friday. And so continue to stay tuned. This is going to be weekly. Feel free to hit me up. I don't bite. If you want to talk about something or if you have any questions, I might start sponsoring a questions section, and no questions a dumb one. And even if you're not a part of my family and you want me to look up something about your specific family, or you want to tell me a specific fact about your family that may, cross, exist in some of my stories, please hit me up. So again, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Stay rooted. Peace.